The January morning fog rolled thick and heavy across Narragansett Bay, its ghostly tendrils wrapping around the control tower of TF Green International Airport like a cold, damp blanket. The familiar rhythm of departures and arrivals continued despite the limited visibility, each aircraft emerging from and disappearing into the dense white void like mythical creatures in an ancient tale. Marcus Chun pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the observation deck, his dark eyes tracking every movement on the tarmac below. 13. He was already familiar with every type of aircraft that regularly visited Rhode Island's main airport. His worn leather notebook, a gift from his late mother on his 10th birthday, lay open beside him, its pages filled with meticulously detailed sketches of aircraft and technical specifications that would impress even seasoned pilots. "Here's your coffee, kiddo." His father's voice broke through his concentration. Dr. James Chun, still wearing his hospital scrubs under his winter coat after a long night shift at Rhode Island Hospital, handed his son a steaming cup. It was their Sunday morning ritual, watching the early flights while sharing coffee. Though Marcus's cup was more milk than coffee, a compromise they'd reached after months of negotiation. "Thanks, Dad," Marcus murmured, not taking his eyes off a Delta Airlines A320neo that was slowly taxiing toward runway 05. "Look at those sharklets. They're different from the old winglets. Increases fuel efficiency by about 3.5% compared to the previous design." James smiled wearily, used to his son's encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft. Since losing Sarah 2 years ago to an aggressive form of lymphoma, Marcus had thrown himself into aviation with an intensity that sometimes worried his father. The therapist had assured him it was healthy, a way for Marcus to maintain control in a world that had seemed so chaotic after his mother's passing. Still, James couldn't help but wonder if his son was using planes as a way to escape reality rather than face it. "The fog's pretty thick today," James observed, trying to engage his son in conversation. "Must be making things interesting for the pilots." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, finally turning away from the window. "They're operating under Cat 3 procedures," he explained, his face lighting up with the chance to share his knowledge. "The ILS system here can handle approaches down to 50 feet decision height with 600 feet RVR. That's runway visual range," he added, seeing his father's confused expression. "But most airlines require at least 1,000 feet RVR for safety margins." James checked his watch, noting the time. Their own flight would be boarding soon. Providence Air Flight 847 to Chicago O'Hare. The trip had been his idea, a weekend getaway to visit the Museum of Science and Industry's new aviation exhibit. It would be Marcus's first time flying since the funeral, when they'd traveled to Boston for his mother's specialist treatments. "We should head to security," James suggested gently. "You know how backed up it can get, even on Sunday mornings." Marcus nodded, carefully closing his notebook and tucking it into his backpack. As they walked away from the observation deck, he cast one last look over his shoulder at the fog-shrouded runway. Something about the morning felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The security line moved surprisingly quickly for a Sunday. Marcus watched the TSA officers with interest, noting how they processed passengers with mechanical efficiency. He'd memorized most of the security protocols through his endless reading about aviation, and he could probably recite the prohibited items list from memory if asked. As they approached their gate, Marcus's excitement began to build. Their aircraft was already parked at the jet bridge, a Boeing 737-800, registration number N271PA. He'd looked up their flight the night before, tracking the aircraft's history and maintenance records through various aviation databases. "Did you know this particular plane has been in service for 8 years?" he told his father as they settled into the waiting area. "It just had its D-check completed last month at the maintenance facility in Indianapolis. That's the most comprehensive inspection type, where they basically take the entire aircraft apart and check everything." James nodded, thumbing through emails on his phone. He'd learned to listen with one ear to his son's aviation lectures, picking up enough to ask relevant questions when needed. Is that why you insisted on this flight instead of the earlier one? Marcus grinned sheepishly. Well, the other flight was on an older airframe. This one has the updated flight control computers and the latest version of the FMS software. He paused, then added more quietly, Mom would have appreciated the attention to detail. James felt the familiar pang in his chest at the mention of Sarah. She had always encouraged Marcus's interests, no matter how obscure or technical they became. She would have, he agreed softly, reaching over to squeeze his son's shoulder. The boarding process began precisely on schedule, another detail that Marcus appreciated. As they made their way down the jet bridge, he could barely contain his excitement. This was more than just a flight to him. It was a chance to experience everything he'd spent years studying. When they reached the aircraft door, Marcus paused briefly to peek into the cockpit, his eyes widening at the array of instruments. The flight crew seemed amused by his obvious enthusiasm. "First time flying?" the captain asked, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded Marcus of his mother. "No, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice filled with respect. "But it's my first time on a next-generation 737 with the Rockwell Collins FMS update." The captain raised her eyebrows, clearly impressed. "You know your stuff, kid. How'd you learn all that?" "Books, simulator programs, online forums," Marcus explained, suddenly shy under the attention. "I want to be a pilot someday." "Well, keep studying like that, and maybe I'll be working for you someday," she said with a warm smile. "Want to take a quick look at our pre-flight checklist?" Marcus's face lit up as he stepped into the cockpit, taking in every detail. The captain pointed out various instruments and switches, and Marcus surprised her by correctly identifying most of them. It was only when the first officer reminded them of the boarding schedule that Marcus reluctantly made his way to his seat, his mind buzzing with excitement. As they settled into their seats, Marcus by the window, his father in the middle, the morning fog began to lift, revealing patches of clear blue sky above. Perfect flying weather, Marcus thought, recalling the meteorology chapters he'd studied. The air was stable, with good visibility above the surface layer and minimal wind shear reported at altitude. The familiar safety briefing began, but Marcus wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed on the wing outside his window, watching the control surfaces move as the flight crew ran through their pre-flight checks. He could identify each flap, aileron, and spoiler, understanding their functions as intimately as most kids his age knew video game controls. The pushback from the gate was smooth, the tug operator expertly maneuvering their aircraft away from the terminal. Marcus felt the vibrations as the engines spooled up, the distinctive whine of the CFM56 turbofan's music to his ears. They taxied toward runway 05, joining the queue of morning departures. As they waited for takeoff clearance, Marcus ran through the procedures in his head, just as he did in his flight simulator at home. He knew exactly what the pilots would be doing: setting takeoff power, checking engine parameters, confirming taxi weight and balance calculations. Finally, they turned onto the runway. Marcus felt the familiar thrill of anticipation as the engines roared to full power, pushing them back in their seats as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. He watched the airspeed indicator in his mind's eye. 80 knots, V1, rotate. The nose lifted, and suddenly they were airborne, the ground falling away beneath them as they climbed into the morning sky. Marcus watched Rhode Island shrink below them, the coastline becoming a delicate lacework of beaches and inlets, the city's mere dots on the landscape. Providence Air Flight 847 was on its way to Chicago, carrying 146 passengers and crew, including one very excited young aviation enthusiast who had no idea that his extensive knowledge would soon be put to the ultimate test. They had been in the air for just over an hour when Marcus first noticed something wasn't quite right. The plane had entered a series of subtle oscillations, nothing major, but enough that his trained eye could tell it wasn't normal. He glanced at his father, who was absorbed in reading medical journals on his tablet. seemingly unaware of the slight changes in the aircraft's movement. Marcus frowned, his mind racing through possible explanations. The sky was clear above them, so it wasn't weather-related turbulence. The engine sound remained steady, ruling out obvious mechanical issues. But something was definitely off about the way the plane was behaving. He pulled out his notebook, beginning to jot down his observations. The oscillations seemed to follow a pattern, a slight pitch-up, followed by a correction, then a minor roll to the left before stabilizing. To most passengers, it would feel like mild turbulence, but Marcus knew better. This was something systematic, possibly related to the flight control systems. As Marcus continued to monitor the aircraft's behavior, the oscillations gradually became more pronounced. He noticed the flight attendants exchanging concerned glances as they moved through the cabin, their practiced smiles not quite masking their growing unease. Through his window, he could see the occasional flutter of the ailerons, making micro-adjustments more frequently than normal. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, maintaining a professional tone despite a subtle undercurrent of tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. As a precaution, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We'll update you as soon as we have more information." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He'd read enough accident reports and technical bulletins to know that minor technical difficulties could encompass a wide range of issues, from trivial to catastrophic. He began mentally reviewing everything he knew about the Boeing 737-800 systems, trying to diagnose what might be causing these symptoms. "Dad," he whispered, closing his notebook. "Something's really wrong with the plane." Dr. Chun looked up from his medical journal, studying his son's face. He'd learned to trust Marcus's aviation instincts. "What do you mean?" Before Marcus could explain, another announcement came, this time from the first officer. His voice carried a noticeable edge of stress. "This is your first officer speaking. Due to a developing situation with our control systems, we're declaring an emergency and diverting to Albany International Airport. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." Gasps and murmurs filled the cabin as passengers exchanged worried glances. Marcus noticed several people reaching for their phones, despite the flight attendants' reminders about keeping them in airplane mode. The plane banked sharply to the left before the pilots managed to level it again. Marcus could feel the flight controls fighting against each other, the autopilot trying to maintain course while something else was forcing the aircraft off its intended path. "The stabilizer trim system," Marcus muttered, more to himself than his father. "It's acting independently of the autopilot commands." He remembered reading about similar incidents in aviation forums, though those had been caught much earlier in the flight. A violent shudder ran through the entire aircraft, causing several passengers to scream. Overhead bins popped open, spilling bags into the aisle. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling as the cabin began to lose pressure. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I think they're losing control of the aircraft. The trim system malfunction is probably just part of a bigger problem with the flight control computers." James Chun stared at his son, recognizing the focused look that came over Marcus when he was deep in problem-solving mode. Before he could respond, another violent shake rocked the plane, followed by an eerie silence from the cockpit. The lead flight attendant rushed forward to check on the flight crew, then immediately turned back, her face pale with shock. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Both pilots are unconscious." James immediately unbuckled his seatbelt, but Marcus grabbed his arm. "Dad, wait, they need a doctor in the cockpit, but they also need someone who can fly this plane. I can help." His father stared at him in disbelief. "Marcus, you've never actually flown a plane. This isn't a simulation. I've spent over 3.000 hours on professional-grade flight simulators." Marcus interrupted. "I know every system on this aircraft. I've practiced emergency procedures hundreds of times. Dad, there's no time to argue. They need you to help the pilots. And they need me to keep this plane in the air. For a moment, James Chun was torn between his instinct to protect his son and the understanding that Marcus might be their only hope. He looked into his son's eyes and saw not fear, but determination, the same look Sarah had shown during her battle with cancer. "Okay," he said finally, his medical training taking over. "But be careful. I can't lose you too." Marcus nodded and sprinted toward the cockpit, his mind already shifting into the focus state he entered when running complex emergency scenarios in his simulator. The scene that greeted him was dire. Both pilots were slumped over their controls, their complexions a telling cherry red color. Carbon monoxide poisoning. He heard his father diagnose behind him. "We need to get them on oxygen immediately." Marcus slid into the captain's seat, his hands shaking slightly as they touched the real controls for the first time. The instrument panel was exactly where it should be, identical to his simulator setup at home. But now it was displaying a cascade of warnings that made his heart race. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the immediate priorities. First, establish communication with air traffic control. Second, assess the aircraft systems. Third, plan for landing. The steps were clear in his mind, practiced countless times in simulation. "This is Providence Air 847, he called over the radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have an emergency situation. Both pilots are incapacitated, possibly due to carbon monoxide poisoning. I'm Marcus Chin. I'm 13 years old, and I believe I can fly the plane." There was a moment of stunned silence before the controller responded. "Providence 847, this is Albany approach. Did you say you're 13 years old?" "Affirmative," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. "I need immediate vectors to Albany and technical assistance. We have multiple system failures and degrading flight control response. Request patching to Boeing technical support if available." Behind him, his father was working with a flight attendant to move the unconscious pilots out of the cockpit and administer emergency oxygen. Marcus could hear the concerned murmurs of passengers, but he forced himself to tune them out. Right now, his entire world needed to be the flight deck and its instruments. A new voice came over the radio, older, calmer, with the confident tone of someone who knew the 737 inside and out. "Providence 847. This is Dave Wilson from Boeing Operations Center in Seattle. We're receiving your telemetry data now. Talk me through what you're seeing." Marcus described the symptoms rapidly but precisely, using proper aviation terminology. Primary flight control computers showing intermittent failures. Stabilizer trim system is fighting the autopilot inputs, getting erratic readings from angle of attack sensors on both sides. Starting to see disagreement in airspeed indicators. "Copy that," Dave responded. "Your system status matches what we're seeing in the telemetry. First priority is to regain reliable flight control. We need to switch to alternate law and disconnect the autopilot. Are you comfortable hand-flying the aircraft?" Marcus swallowed hard. Hand-flying a commercial airliner with degraded controls wasn't something he'd ever done in real life. But he understood the principles, had practiced similar scenarios in his simulator. "Affirmative," he said, his voice stronger now. "Walk me through the procedure." "Okay, Marcus, first, we need to isolate the faulty systems. Look at the overhead panel. You'll see the flight control computer switches." For the next several minutes, Marcus followed Dave's instructions, methodically working through the procedures to regain control of the aircraft. His hands moved across the switches and controls with practiced precision, muscle memory from countless simulation hours taking over. When the autopilot disconnected, the control yoke immediately became heavy in his hands. The plane wanted to pitch up and roll left, the same tendency he'd noticed earlier, but now much more pronounced. Marcus fought against it, applying constant pressure to keep the wings level. "She's heavy on the controls," he reported, straining slightly. "Feels like we've got a significant trim imbalance." "Understood," Dave replied, "We're going to try to reset the trim system, but first we need to get you set up for the approach to Albany. They're clearing a path for you now." The next challenge presented itself almost immediately. Dark clouds loomed ahead, and the weather report for Albany wasn't encouraging. Snow showers were reducing visibility, and the winds were gusting to 25 knots. In the cabin, his father had stabilized the pilots as best he could and returned to the cockpit. "How are you doing, son?" he asked quietly, placing a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Managing," Marcus replied tersely, too focused on controlling the aircraft to say more. The plane shuddered as they encountered turbulence, requiring all his concentration to maintain steady flight. Providence 847, Albany approach. The controller's voice returned. "You're cleared for the ILS approach to runway 01. Winds 360 at 15, gusting 25, ceiling 800 feet. Visibility 2 miles in light snow." Marcus felt a flutter of panic in his chest. An instrument landing in these conditions would be challenging for an experienced pilot, let alone a 13-year-old who had never actually landed a real aircraft. But then he remembered something his mother used to tell him during her hospital stays. "Fear is just excitement without breath. Take a deep breath, and excitement returns." He inhaled deeply, letting the fear transform into focused energy. "Roger, Albany approach. Providence 847 is established on the localizer for runway 01. The snow was falling heavier now, reducing visibility to a gray wall ahead of the aircraft. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the instruments, knowing that in these conditions, his visual references could be deceiving. The ILS guidance showed him perfectly aligned with the runway centerline, though maintaining that position required constant attention. "Providence 847, you're 5 miles from touchdown," the controller announced. "Check gear down and confirm you're configured for landing." Marcus ran through his mental checklist. "Landing gear down and locked," he confirmed, after checking the 3 green indicator lights. "Flaps 30, auto brake set to maximum. Request final wind check." Winds now 355 at 18, gusting 28. Came the response. "You're cleared to land runway 01. The Boeing 737 bucked in the turbulent air as they descended through 2.000 feet. Marcus's shirt was soaked with sweat, his arms aching from the constant pressure needed on the controls. The trim issue was making the aircraft nose-heavy, requiring significant back pressure on the yoke to maintain the proper descent angle. "Looking good, Marcus," Dave's voice encouraged from Seattle. "Remember what we discussed about the wind correction angle. Keep that wing down into the wind." Marcus nodded to himself, applying slight left aileron to counter the crosswind. His simulator practice had prepared him for this, but the physical sensation of actually fighting the controls was far more demanding than he'd expected. 1,000 feet, the synthetic voice called out. Marcus could feel the tension in the cabin behind him. The passengers had been remarkably quiet since learning their fate was in the hands of a 13-year-old. But now the only sound was the howl of the wind and the steady drone of the engines. "Providence 847, check minimum fuel," the controller prompted. Marcus glanced at the fuel gauges. Fuel quantity 4.200 pounds remaining, sufficient for one approach and diversion if necessary. Inside, though, he knew they couldn't afford a go-around. The combination of deteriorating weather, mechanical issues, and his own fatigue meant this had to be a successful landing. At 800 feet, they broke through the cloud base. The runway lights appeared through the swirling snow, seeming impossibly far away. Marcus forced himself to trust his instruments rather than his eyes, maintaining the prescribed descent rate. 500 feet, the synthetic voice announced. The crosswind was trying to push them off the centerline, but Marcus compensated, keeping the localizer needle-centered. 400, 300. His father's hand squeezed his shoulder gently. "Your mother would be so proud," James whispered. 100 feet, 50, 40, 30. Marcus began the flare maneuver, gradually raising the nose to slow their descent rate. The snow made it difficult to judge their height above the runway, but years of simulator practice had ingrained the timing in his muscle memory.
2010.
The main wheels touched down firmly, harder than Marcus would have liked, but solid and stable. The reverse thrust roared as he deployed the thrust reversers, and the auto brake system kicked in, pressing them all forward in their seats. As they decelerated through the blowing snow, Marcus could see emergency vehicles racing alongside them, their lights flashing through the winter storm. The aircraft slowly came to a stop near the end of the runway, and for a moment, complete silence fell over the cockpit. Then the cabin erupted in applause and cheers. Passengers were hugging each other, crying, praying, all the pent-up fear and tension releasing at once. Marcus sat motionless in the captain's seat, his hands still gripping the control yoke, hardly able to believe what he'd just accomplished. Providence 847, welcome to Albany. The controller's voice broke through, thick with emotion. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Well done, young man. Emergency response teams were already boarding the aircraft, rushing to attend to the still unconscious pilots. The preliminary investigation would later reveal that a maintenance error had allowed engine bleed air contaminated with carbon monoxide to enter the cockpit ventilation system, combined with a software fault in the flight control computers. It had created a perfect storm of failures that would have been catastrophic if not for one young aviation enthusiast's extensive knowledge and remarkable composure. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Emergency medical teams rushed the pilots to Albany Medical Center, while hazmat crews swept the aircraft for lingering carbon monoxide. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived within hours, their initial focus on the aircraft's environmental control system and the flight control computers. Marcus found himself in a small conference room at the airport, surrounded by officials from the FAA, Providence Air executives, and Boeing representatives. His father sat protectively beside him as he recounted every detail of the flight, his technical knowledge continuing to impress the seasoned aviation professionals. The trim malfunction became apparent approximately 1 hour into the flight. Marcus explained, sketching diagrams in his notebook as he spoke. The oscillations suggested a conflict between the primary and secondary flight control computers, possibly triggered by corrupted sensor data. The Boeing engineers exchanged meaningful glances. What this 13-year-old was describing aligned perfectly with their preliminary analysis of the flight data recorder. And when did you first suspect carbon monoxide poisoning? An NTSB investigator asked. When I saw the pilot's condition, Marcus replied, his voice quieter now as he remembered the frightening scene. The cherry red complexion is characteristic of CO poisoning. I learned that from my dad's medical books. Plus, the gradual onset of control problems suggested the pilots might have been experiencing cognitive effects before losing consciousness. As the debriefing continued, news of the incident was spreading rapidly across the country. Media vans began gathering outside the airport, all seeking interviews with the young hero who had saved Providence Air Flight 847. But Marcus was overwhelmed by the attention, preferring to stay in the quiet conference room, discussing technical details with the investigation team. Late that evening, they received word that both pilots were recovering well. The carbon monoxide had been caught early enough to prevent lasting damage. Thanks to James Chen's quick medical intervention, the captain, when told who had landed her aircraft, reportedly said, I knew that kid was special when he started talking about FMS updates. 3 months later, Marcus stood at the familiar observation deck at TF Green International Airport, watching the morning traffic with new eyes. The events of that snowy day in Albany had changed his life in ways he never expected. The official NTSB report had praised his exceptional aviation knowledge and remarkable composure under pressure. Providence Air had established a scholarship program in his name for young aspiring pilots. Boeing had invited him to their training facility in Seattle, where he'd spent countless hours in their professional flight simulators, this time with their top instructors. But fame wasn't what Marcus sought. He had given a few carefully chosen interviews, accepted a civilian award for bravery, and then retreated back into his quiet life in Rhode Island. His father worried that the experience might have traumatized him, but if anything, it had strengthened his resolve to pursue a career in aviation. "Ready for your coffee?" James appeared beside him, 2 cups in hand, both real coffee now. No milk needed. Their Sunday morning ritual had survived unchanged, despite everything. "Thanks, Dad," Marcus said, accepting the cup. "Did you see they finally published the full technical report on the Flight 847 incident?" James nodded. The investigation had revealed a perfect storm of factors. A maintenance oversight that had allowed bleed air contamination, a software bug in the flight control computers that had been triggered by sensor disagreements, and weather conditions that had complicated the emergency landing. "They're implementing new safety procedures because of what happened," Marcus continued, his eyes tracking a departing aircraft. "Better carbon monoxide detection systems, updated flight control software, revised maintenance protocols." "Your mother would have loved that," James said softly. "How you turned a crisis into an opportunity for positive change." Marcus smiled, touching the worn notebook in his pocket, the same one he'd had that day, now filled with even more detailed technical notes and observations. "She always said everything happens for a reason." A Providence Air 737 taxied past their observation point, its livery gleaming in the morning sun. Marcus could see the cockpit windows, remembering how it felt to sit in that left seat, fighting to keep the aircraft stable in the blowing snow. The memory no longer frightened him. Instead, it reinforced his conviction that this was his calling. "Dad," he said, turning away from the window, "remember how you said I could start flight lessons when I turned 14? James smiled. "Your birthday's next month, isn't it? Already got you enrolled at the flight school here. The instructors are pretty excited to teach the kid who landed a 737 in a snowstorm." Marcus's face lit up with genuine joy, an expression James hadn't seen often since Sarah's passing. "Really? You mean it?" "Of course," James replied. "Though I have to warn you, they're probably going to be extra strict with you, given your reputation." As they walked across the terminal toward the flight school building for an introductory meeting, Marcus felt a deep sense of contentment. The path ahead was clear now: private pilot's license, instrument rating, commercial certificate, and eventually, an airline transport pilot license. It would take years of study and training, but he knew he could do it. Above them, another airliner climbed into the Rhode Island sky, its engines roaring with familiar power. Marcus watched it ascend, remembering his mother's words about fear and excitement. She had been right with the right mindset. With enough preparation and determination, anything was possible. The flight school's Cessna 172 waited on the ramp, small but pristine. It was a far cry from the 737 he'd landed in Albany. But to Marcus, it represented something even more important: the first step toward his future. A future that had been shaped by an extraordinary moment but would be built on thousands of ordinary ones. As he began the pre-flight inspection, moving around the aircraft with practiced precision, Marcus thought about all the twists and turns that had led him to this point. The loss of his mother, the countless hours spent learning about aviation, that terrifying day over Albany, all of it had prepared him for this path. His instructor watched approvingly as Marcus completed the checklist without prompting. "You know," she said, "in all my years of teaching, I've never had a student who saved an airliner before starting lessons. I just did what needed to be done." Marcus replied, his standard response to any mention of that day. "Besides, today I'm starting fresh. There's always more to learn." The engine rumbled to life, and Marcus felt that familiar thrill of anticipation, the same one he'd experienced watching planes as a child. But now it was different. Now he wasn't just an observer but a participant in the grand dance of flight. His father watched from the flight school office as the Cessna taxied away, his heart full of pride and a touch of bittersweet memory. Sarah would have loved to see this moment, but somehow James felt she was watching anyway. Her spirit carried on the same winds that would lift their son into the sky.